cooking everything that I liked the most. But it took a lot of preparation. I remember when her mind was beginning to struggle, I took her to the store. My job was to help her. I did not know anything. It was the dumbest thing I can imagine. But I'd walk around and I said, Mom, do you use this? And she said, do I? And I'd say, I think I remember seeing this on the counter. Okay, let's get that. When we got home, my sister said, oh, you did it so wrong. It's all right. I was there for the eating, not the planning. But it takes a lot of preparation for the Passover lamb, finding the absolute most perfect lamb, starting to grind different spices, preparing certain kinds of oil. And we're going to talk about what happened in the Passover feast and then talk about how that translates into what we call the Lord's Supper. It's all His. When I was preaching in Portales, this guy offered us the chance to go to Albuquerque and see people go through and do the Passover just the same way they did in Israel. This guy had been a teacher of rabbinical studies, and they were doing it, and I thought, it's just not that great a meal to spend 10, 12 hours on. But it was an important one. It ties back to their history. Jesus would be engaged in a struggle with the devil for the victory of the souls of mankind. So it's logical to me that he would need a day of silence on Wednesday before preparing and getting ready for this struggle. It talks about how he would go back to Bethany. That's where Mary and Martha and Lazarus lived. It was very, very close to the city of Jerusalem. And we're going to see that they come to play in the story at this point. Regardless of what happened that day, Jesus was ready because Thursday was a day of fellowship with his disciples, and he prepared them for what was to come. You know, it's an interesting thing. When God moves in a major way, he sets a day of rest. They called it Sabbaton. And I think before we gear up for big things, taking a little time to rest is probably smart as well. We'll begin our look at what happened on the Thursday before Jesus was executed by looking at the preparation of the Passover feast in Matthew 26. We'll start by reading verse 1 and verse 2. Incidentally, if you're interested, I'm just keeping all these notes in one long document. When we get done, if you would like to have the whole thing on the life of Christ, I'll sell it. No, I'll give it to you. Because you may want to go back and reflect on it at a later time. Matthew 26, 1 and 2. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Passover's coming. That's a time where you celebrated your freedom and that God set you free. And he is going to be taken away, put in chains, beaten, betrayed by one of his closest friends. It's not going to be the way a Passover should be. If the Jews had their way, they would have taken him outside the city, put him in the valley, and just thrown huge stones upon him till he was dead. That was the primary ways the Jews killed people in their time. Sounds gruesome, doesn't it? But they didn't have the right to do that because of the Roman government. They were going to have to do this a little different. It was necessary for him who knew no sin to be made sin, to be made a curse for all mankind. It's talked about in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. Anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. All the way back in the time of the Old Testament, crucifixion was common. They called it dying on the tree or dying on the stake back in the times of old. And the Romans, they came and made it much more scientifically threatening with the big crossbar and all these different things. But every Jew grew up with crucifixion. Every Jew from the time of the old law grew up seeing people killed because they were a curse under God. They didn't deserve to win because God cursed them. It's going to be so interesting because the only one not cursed is going to die on a cross. Matthew 26, 3 through 5. It says, Then the chief priests and elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. The Jewish leaders, chief priests, elders, high priest, they gathered and said, We need to kill Jesus, but let's not do it on the Passover. That would be too much for the people. They might all turn against us. They were gathering in a very, very specific place to the Jews, the place where they could hide from the Romans and make their decisions in secret. And there they made the plan to kill Jesus. It was a part of the palace of the high priest, a meeting area. I was blessed to go walk into that room. You walk through the courtyard of the chicken, commemorating where Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed. You go into this building, this little anteroom, and it is a very, very, really pretty small room, completely closed off, and it was where the Jews did their scheming. And that's where the religious leaders of the time gathered. How are they going to kill Jesus, was the question. They're not allowed to stone him anymore. How are they going to kill Jesus? In the New International Version, Matthew says they're going to do it in some sly way. That word sly there in the Greek literally goes back to setting a trap for an animal. You cover it up with leaves, you do all those things, and in that sly way, the animal's walking through and suddenly gets caught up in the trap, and then you can kill him. They're going to be at their sneakiest. They are going to make a plan. Sly was a good word for what they were doing. They slyly prepared for his capture. They were not going to be open in their arresting of Jesus, nor would they be honest. In their own way and in their own words, they were not going to be honest in the trial. They were going to try to trip him up in some way. They said they were not going to do it on a feast day because there would be too many people. It might cause a riot. It's humorous that on the day of the feast, that was the very day that they ended up, at the very end of the day, as soon as the crowds were going away, they arrested him in the Garden of Gethsemane. The very day they asked Judas to betray the Christ. They just needed to understand that they were not in control of this situation. God was. You can plot and you can plan, but God's will still is what reigns supreme. Matthew 26, 6 through 13 says, Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his hand as he reclined at the table. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, Why all this waste? This could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring the ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. In John chapter 11, the passage right before this one in John, John goes to the town of Bethany because a close friend had died. The friend's name was Lazarus. Jesus wept with his sisters, Mary and Martha, and then he raised Lazarus from the dead. In John 12, Jesus is still in the city of Bethany, a town just about 1.5 miles from Jerusalem. Martha prepares a dinner, serves it to Jesus. Mary anointed the feet of Jesus with pure nard. Nard was a very expensive ointment from India. When I was in India, I got to smell nard. I guess it was a great smell. I don't know. I like baby lotion more, but still, that was all right. It was very, very expensive. They would transport it around the world in an alabaster jar. Alabaster was a chalky white substance that they would wet and form into holders for things like this, and then you would break it open to pour it out on someone. It wasn't something used a little at a time. I think it's interesting that the word used for alabaster there is our word for gypsum. Where I grew up, it's caliche, and we would drive down caliche roads, and those big stones that would crackle underneath the tires were what they were calling alabaster at this time. Be hollowed out and filled with pure nard. A pound of pure nard was really expensive. It would have cost Mary about 300 days' wages for a healthy man, almost a year's wage. Estimated value today would be about $30,000 for a vial of pure nard. I can almost see why Judas said, hey, we could sell that. But it was there for a very special purpose. John 12, 1 through 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me with you." There's a lot going on in this text. A lot going on. Mary and Martha are both doing all they can to honor Jesus after he raised their brother from the dead. Think about someone in your life that you have lost, and think about if they were brought back from the dead. It's an amazing thing. Mary and Martha were doing all they could to honor Jesus after raising their brother. Judas said we should sell the ointment and give the money to the poor. He was going to sell it at a bargain basement price, just to have the money in his hand. This amount of denarii, it's talking about 300 denarii. We're going to see the basic equivalent of how much it's worth when Judas has silver placed in his hand. It's almost exactly the same. The prediction of Judas's betrayal of Christ was at hand. Matthew 26, 14 through 16, we see a preview to that. Well, I may not have Matthew 26, 14. Let's read it. Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. What occurred here is very interesting. One of Jesus' own, one he had chosen, one whom he invested 3 years of his life, one that he had trusted, not only with the work of being an apostle, but with the treasury, with the money they were blessed with to do the work they were going to do. He was going to betray him. All the money with which they had bought their food and lived was placed under his control. He would have been one of the most trusted apostles in their group. Regardless, he went and bargained with the chief priest. "How much will you give me if I turn him over to you?" he asked. He was not only a thief of the treasury, but wanted to profit from the profit of his arrest and his death. They gave Judas 30 pieces of silver. It's not a big sum of money. Jesus wasn't sold for a fortune. He was sold for the price of about 10 meals. You could buy a small field that would not grow any grain with it. That's ultimately what will happen. But Judas sold him out so cheaply. This fulfilled Zechariah 11, verse 12, in which Zechariah said they would weigh out 30 pieces of silver for the Messiah. Therefore, Judas was willing for 1 month's pay to sell the Lord into his death. Now, I've had some bad friends. There is a book that's popular now, and it talks about how Judas was confused. He was trying to do everything right. He really wasn't a thief. He really wasn't doing anything wrong. He just thought he was helping Jesus be exalted as the Messiah. Oh no, Bible's clear, he's a thief. Bible's clear, his motives are bad. It's clear he went and made a deal to sell Jesus into their hands. It's interesting that in Exodus 21, verse 32, Exodus 21:32, 30 pieces of silver was the price paid if a person's ox gored the servant of another. It's just interesting to me. I don't know why it's so interesting, but if you had an ox with horns, someone had a servant walk across your field and that ox gored him, you would have to pay that servant and his master 30 pieces of silver. It was called the price of an ox. Not buying an ox, that was much more than 30 pieces. But if it hurt someone, that was the price you paid to the priest. In this case, it was 30 pieces of silver, and Judas was getting a month's pay. He was getting the price we paid for a master of a servant gored by someone's ox. He also got paid in advance. They trusted him to do this even after they paid him. They gave him money, and he then began to wait for an opportunity to turn Jesus over. He was trusted not only by Jesus, he was trusted by the Jewish leaders. Sitting on Mount of Olives, there's this one area to the side where people come from the back if they don't want to be seen. Traditionally, that's where they say the men came to arrest Christ. Having people come to arrest me would be horrible, but if it was my best friend leading the men, I can't imagine. Jesus is preparing for that very moment. Luke 22, 7 through 13 says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Said to him, follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there." And they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Remember when we started getting the foal of a donkey? He said, go up and ask that guy. He'll give you the foal of the donkey. Here he says, what about a big room? There's a lot of us. How are we going to find a place big enough for us all to celebrate? You'll see a guy with a water jar. Follow him and ask him if we can use his upper room where they kept their guests. In getting ready for the Passover, a site had to be selected. Jesus had already had that prepared, since it had already been in his mind and the mind of the Father. Find the man with the water jar. Tell him the master needs a room. He'll show you the room. They made big money from these rooms, but not this time. Maybe it's another secret disciple, we don't know. But they are being given a room to spend this important time together in. As soon as the place was found, his house had to be ceremonially prepared. There are many sources that you can read about what all goes on. A man named Cunningham Gauke wrote a book called The Life and Works of Jesus, the first volume, and he discusses the Jewish preparation for the Passover. I went through and sort of made up a list. The first thing they did was sweep it absolutely clean and mop it, thus sanitizing the room where it was to be healed. You could not have that perfect lamb coming into an imperfect room. So they would get up and they would clean top to bottom that room. Then they searched the whole house to make sure that every single thing that would cause corruption was moved. Couldn't be anything with uncleanness. Everything had to be clean and pure. Anything that wasn't like that had to be removed from the house. Then the house was ceremonially blessed, and certain furniture was placed in the room that was being prepared for offering of the Passover lamb. Then they would go out and select the lamb to be offered. It had to be without spot and without blemish. I used to sell lambs. You know how hard it is to find one that has no skin issues? If you find one, he's going to go run into a wire hanging off a fence and ruin it for you. But that was really a hard thing, and they had to go and find that lamb. They would then take it to the priest, who would cut out a portion of it away, cut that portion away and burn another portion. They would leave with the portion of the animal that was prepared for them to roast. They would provide the new wine that was to be drunk, along with the unleavened cakes, bitter herbs that were to be eaten. In remembering the Passover, they remembered that they had to move quickly. They had to get out of Egypt so fast. So they drank new wine, fresh wine, wine just squeezed that day. They went and they took this lamb and all the things, got it all prepared. The bread was unleavened because they didn't have time for leavening. I wish the meal had been a little different, because we're going to take a semblance of it here in a few minutes. Not the biggest grape juice fan, but I do love Christ. We'll take it together. They made a paste of crushed fruit moistened with vinegar. They made it look sort of like a brownish red clay, reminding them of how their forefathers made bricks in Egypt. It was a day of hasty activity for Peter and John as they fulfilled their obligation and made certain that all was ready for the Passover. Who could he trust? Peter and John. That seems to be true all the way through. In Luke 22:14, the Passover began to be observed. Down in the temple area, a silver trumpet was blown to announce the feast time. When that trumpet was blown, Jesus said that he was anxious to eat this Passover with them. Why was he anxious to eat the Passover? First, he knew that the lamb they were eating not only looked back to commemorate a deliverance from Egypt with blood put over the doorpost, but it also looks forward to the sacrifice that Jesus would make in just a day or two. Second, he wanted his disciples to know they were about to partake of the meal that would forever be celebrated in the kingdom, in the church. He points them ahead to what the church would do from that point on. So that moment was a big, important thing for you and me as well. They would eat this supper so that the world could participate in the feast they were eating that day, celebrating a pure and perfect lamb. I think that's beautiful. Every first day of the week, every Lord's Day, men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation would commemorate the deliverance not from physical bondage, but from spiritual bondage of sin. The bread that we eat on the Lord's Day commemorates his flesh. It is unleavened. It's made without any yeast. It's not made for our nourishment. It's made for us to remember when they had to move so quickly and how quick these final days with Jesus went. The new wine that was drunk on the Passover and the new wine that we drink on the Lord's Day represents his blood that was to be shed for their sins and for the sins of the entire world. This meal was going to be like none other. I was talking to someone once about drinking, and he said, you know, at the Passover meal, they almost got drunk all the time. And I said, well, that would be crazy, getting drunk on brand new wine that had just been squeezed that day. That would be a miracle unto itself. And we still take that today. In Luke 22, verse 14, the Passover was observed. In John 13, John discusses Jesus' humility, his holiness, and his happiness as he prepares for this special day. John 13, 1 through 5 says, Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and he was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This was such an important moment. It begins with Jesus wanting to show the full extent of his love to each of his disciples. Judas is in the room. Jesus knew everything that Judas was going to do, but he wanted to show him just how much he loved him. Peter's going to betray him, and Jesus wanted to show him just how much he loved him. Apostles would flee, but he wanted to show them just how much he loves them. That's sort of the way of family, isn't it? I've got some family members that I really sort of hope never come walking through these back doors. Because your first thought would be, wait, these are related to you? Because I tell you all the stories about all the really good ones. But we love them. We help them. Because they're family. Jesus honors Judas knowing what he's about to do. He wanted to show the full extent of his love for them. How do you do that? Miracles? That'd be good. Making them bars of gold? They'd probably have enjoyed that. No. He went over to the side where the servant always stood, the lowest of servants, took off his outer clothing, tied the towel around himself, got the basin of water, and he walked back to the table and he looked at Judas. I don't think this would be nearly as powerful if they were all perfect people sitting at a table. But they weren't. When we sit in front of our table here in a few minutes, everybody going to be worthy for that? Nope. But Jesus shows us in that meal the full extent of his love. Not for us on our best day, but for us on our worst. He still reaches out in love. When he took off his clothes, put on that towel and washed their feet, he was showing them how much love he had. He was showing them how he would humble himself, humiliate himself in order to serve them. However, he would show no more love on the cross than he showed right there in that moment. In the cross, dying on the cross, he showed the full extent of his love. But he also showed the full extent of his love when he prepared this meal and washed their feet. Again, that's the way family is. We'll never be able to imitate the cross. We'll never be able to go to Calvary to purchase people's righteousness and salvation. But we can show the full extent of our love by washing one another's feet, by serving one another in love even when we don't deserve it. God gave His Son the grace to allow Himself to be a humble servant before His apostles that followed Him. An interesting thing is that the word for towel in this passage was not just the ordinary word for towel. It was the slave's towel. Not the servant's towel, the slave's towel. Jesus entered the place that day with the robe of a rabbi, the robe of a teacher, the robe of a leader. He would take that off and He would pick up the towel of a slave. Peter is always Peter. Wait, you can't wash my feet. Okay, then you have nothing to do in my kingdom. How about I stand in the bowl and you pour it over my head? Peter, let me wash your feet. That's the way we are, aren't we? We want to tell Jesus how to do what He's going to do. Peter's going to have a bad day. I love this passage. I love Jesus showing the full extent of His love. I was remembering a time the other day with my little sister Melissa. Something bad happened to her. Her husband ran off with not just another girl, but with two girls. And I can remember what happened to her at the church she was attending the next Sunday. They said, if you had been a better wife, being more loving physically to your husband, this wouldn't have happened. So her big brother went to go see those guys. And I said, Judas never got treated as bad as my sister has. How can we be like that? The lesson isn't Judas is so bad. The lesson is Jesus loved him to the end anyway. It doesn't excuse what he does. He's still going to suffer a penalty for that. But don't we want to love like that? I do. Let's pray as we close. Father, I love this last week as Jesus went about the business He needed to do before being sacrificed for my sins. Father, I just pray that I will be as focused on showing the full extent of my love to those around me as You were to Judas and Peter and all the rest. Father, I pray that we will be thoughtful about this as we take the Lord's Supper together. That we'll appreciate the new wine and the unleavened bread, how they represent the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, but how they also tell us that despite myself, God gives me a place at His table. That's truly beautiful. Be with us as we take it, and be with us as we worship, and be with us as we try to serve You. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.